Hello, my name is Renhua Ming. Welcome to Presidential Hackathon International Track exclusive program, in which we interview critical issues with distinguished figures. In this episode, we are going to discover stories behind the general introduction of Presidential Hackathon. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Taiwan's Digital Minister, Audrey Tang. Audrey Tang is the Executive Director of the Presidential Hackathon Committee since 2018.
Presidential Hackathon. The hacker spirit is always online.
Thank you for being here with us today, Digital Minister.
Really happy to be here.
So to begin with, can you share with us how this idea of Presidential Hackathon came into the organizers' discussion at the beginning? Is there any story behind?
Sure. So Taiwan's had a lot of hackathons, both from the civil society, like the GovZero hackathon that has been going on for more than a decade, to the municipal hackathons, to various different ministries' hackathons. So back in 2016-17, when we're looking at all those different hackathons, we note a major gap, that is the cross-sectoral collaboration. It turns out that many municipalities, when they run hackathons, they produce something that works very well for their locality, but there was not a surefire way for them to scale these local innovations to the national level. And while the national ministries, such as the Ministry of Interior, Transportation, Education, and so on, all host their own hackathons, it's very difficult for them to reach into the local level social innovators. But per our Constitution, the President is actually a constitutional unit that organizes not just the executive branch, but also the judicial, the legislative, the control, and examination branches altogether, including the local levels, and make sure that the society works in a way that is truly cross-sectoral. So by working with the presidential office, we're very happy that we've got connections to not just the domestic branches, but also to the international ones, because our president also is in charge of our international affairs.
One of the frequently asked questions is, why is it called Presidential Hackathon?
Sure. So when we want to figure out the branding toward cross-sectoral and international partnership, it turns out that the president, as I mentioned, is constitutionally mandated to do just that. And because Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, our president, is very much into digital democracy, in her first inauguration speech, she said, before we think of democracy as a showdown between two opposing values, but from now on, democracy needs to be a collaboration, a conversation between many diverse values. And indeed, in taking care of the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 or more very different values going on, both in Taiwan and also internationally. So I think the presidential also makes this digital democracy much more vibrant and cross-sectoral and also diverse and inclusive.
So from your point of view, what makes the Presidential Hackathon so distinctive comparing to other hackathons?
Yeah, I think because the Presidential Hackathon carries a presidential promise. So in the domestic track, for example, after 3 months or so of co-creation of the civil society, the private sector, and the public servants, maybe their proof of concept only work, as I mentioned, on a small town, on a remote island, on a small municipality. But the president, because, well, she can say, once you're the champion, one of 5 champion teams, I'll make sure as the president that there is this legislative support. There's this regulatory support within the administration. There's this fiscal support when it comes to budget, personnel support needed with the examination yuan to make sure that whatever gaps that there exist within our administration or different branches, we work with you to make sure that the local reality become a shared reality on a national level. So what used to take like 5 or more years to make into a reality, for example, telemedicine and things like that, thanks to the presidential mandate, it massively accelerated its reality, its rollout, its deployment, and continuous integration across the different sectors.
So can you share with us some impressive projects from the past 4 or 5 years in both tracks?
Certainly. So one of the earliest champions from our domestic track, that was before we had an international track, was, as I mentioned, this telemedicine project. At that time, there was a helicopter crash because from a remote island, people did not really trust the local clinicians or nurses to treat their friends and families when they're wounded or sick. So they insist to send them via helicopters to the main Taiwan island, to large hospitals and so on. But because of the weather conditions and so on, it resulted in a tragedy. But the local nurses, the local practitioners, they actually want to win the trust from the local people. So they investigated a different way of arranging telemedicine. Instead of between a patient and a remote doctor, they arranged it to be between the helicopter dispatch center, the large hospital in the main Taiwan island, and their small island, small clinic. So the three doctors and nurses from three different places together showed that the family or the friends to the wounded or sick one, that actually the local practitioners can operate or diagnose them correctly with the help of the assistance from the experts from the helicopter dispatch center and also from the large hospital inland. But for those things to work, first, our national healthcare card need to be digitized because at that time it was a IC card, and so not everyone have a card reader handy, and even if they do, to collect consent and so on, they need another card, the citizen digital certificates, in order to sign their agreement to be treated for the personal data to be exchanged and so on. So this is much of a hassle. So in practice, practically nobody do that. So they insist on helicopter transportation. So for this alone, we changed one law, like 7 different regulations, a lot of extra budgets in the infrastructure bill. And so to make sure not only the remote islands, but all the indigenous nations, all the remote areas have this kind of low latency, high bandwidth video conferencing equipment available, and also the personnel and regulation is up to par. And so that investment as a result of the Presidential Hackathon Champion proved to be very effective during our counter-epidemic times, because at that time people also want to use telediagnosis and so on. So it turns out all the infrastructure is already there.
And as you mentioned, there are 2 tracks, domestic track and international track. Can you tell us what's the difference besides of the language difference between 2 tracks?
Certainly. So whereas the domestic track promotes this national level innovation upon our digital infrastructure, it relied on pre-existing infrastructures. For example, the Universal Healthcare Insurance Administration, which already has this very much trusted cybersecurity aware, proactive database that holds the medical records of each and every one. And all the residents and citizens already have this IC card-based infrastructure, the NHI card, so that when we digitalize that, we have existing norms, existing infrastructure. We just say, oh, let's turn it into a QR code. But exactly how that accountability should work, how the ledger should work, the My Health Bank should work, it's exactly the same. However, it would be quite challenging to scale that idea into an international situation, because in many democratic countries, there's no universal healthcare, let alone a universal healthcare card or the NHI Express app, right? So our president, while she can promise that, let's scale it to all the remote islands and indigenous nations, she probably cannot say that, let's just scale it to the entire world. So for the international track, we're looking at the ideas that are even more portable than the domestic track. For example, last year's champion, the AB Street. Well, pretty much everywhere around the globe, there are people who bike. And for the planning of the roads and so on, people have some standardized way to express their preferences on the road layout and things like that. So a AB Street-like innovation stands a much easier time to get promoted around the world, even in the less developed situations where people prefer bikes to cars in many different cases. And so this unites the community who work on biking and a biking-friendly city, because Taiwan is, after all, host of the giant company, right? So we love bikes, and the urban planning capacity of the international community, but with an eye toward actually scaling it so that it can reduce the greenhouse emissions around the world.
So another thing is live long and prosper almost became a traditional etiquette in international track online events. So what makes you appreciate Vulcan Salute so much?
Yeah, live long and prosper, I think speaks to sustainable development. To sustain is to live long. To develop is to prosper. So to me, this is a very short, catchy way to signify our support to the Sustainable Development Goals without reciting all the 17 goals.
So is there anything that you could expect from this year's presidential hackathon?
Oh yeah, face-to-face meetings. Right? So not
Obviously.
just right. So not just AB Street, previous year's champions, but also this year's champions. We look forward to finally meet face-to-face now that our border quarantine is much relaxed. I'm probably the last batch to undergo 7-day quarantine upon returning to Taiwan. Right. Yeah. So hopefully by the third quarter or the fourth quarter of the year, we will be at a place where international travel is back to the level pre-pandemic or even higher. And so the people who previously only connect through two-dimensional video conference can finally get together and brainstorm, huddle, and work on something new.
So if we look into the future, could you paint us a picture that how you imagine the presidential hackathon could be after another 4 to 5 years later?
Sure. So of course, 4 or 5 years later, we'll be very close in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, hopefully. Hopefully. But then what about 2040?
What about it?
Yeah, what about the ideas that can carry us forward to the next generation, like the 6th generation telecommunication? How would it work if anywhere that can receive satellite connection can get this kind of co-presence, like we're meeting face-to-face with very low latency, but theoretically it is possible for us to, in very different time zones, yet communicate as if we're seeing each other face-to-face over a short distance. So while the presidential hackathon so far focuses on things that can be realized within the next fiscal year, we also want to work on something that has a much broader horizon to the year 2030 and beyond, maybe 2040, right? So there's another presidential hackathon-like event that we're cooking so that hopefully it will work in tandem with presidential hackathon to encourage people to dream big and to work on ideas that will take a decade or more to realize.
Wonderful. So let's have faith in it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us today, Digital Minister. The Digital Minister, Audrey Tang, shared the origin story of the Presidential Hackathon. Audrey did much to groom participants from year to year. Yet, there are more to be explored, discussed, and learned. Next episode, we're going to discover what will happen when Oriental philosophy meets technology. So get ready to wear novel lenses and put the thinking cap on. Thank you for watching the Presidential Hackathon International Track exclusive program. Presidential Hackathon, hacker spirit is always online. Until next time.
When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of beings. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that a singularity is near, well, let's always remember the plurality is here.